Hi readers, welcome back to my channel. It's Juan here. I hope you're doing great. If you're new here, I make videos about books, very often classic literature. I post book reviews a couple of times a week, so if you're into reading, please hit the like button and the notification bell so you don't miss any of my content. And please also subscribe and share my videos with other readers you know. Today, we're talking about an incredible novel, which is In Search of Lost Time by the French writer Marcel Proust. In Search of Lost Time was first translated into English as Remembrance of Things Past. It is a 7-volume novel whose original title in French is À la recherche du temps perdu. The 7 volumes were originally published between 1913 and 1927. The titles of the volumes are Swan's Way, In the Shadow of Young Girls in Flower, The Guermantes Way, Sodom and Gomorrah, The Prisoner, The Fugitive, and Time Regained. I own this French omnibus edition that contains all 7 volumes in one, but it is more common to find In Search of Lost Time as 7 volumes in French and only 6 in English. I've noticed that English language editions often publish volumes 5 and 6, so The Prisoner and The Fugitive, as 1 volume. But as usual, you will find links to as many versions of In Search of Lost Time in English and French as I could find. If you buy any books for my links, I will receive a small commission, but it will not cost you anything extra and you will be supporting my work. All the links are in the show notes. This video is for people who haven't read the novel, people who have started the novel, and those who have already read the whole thing. Apart from reviewing it, I will give you some tips on how to read it based on my own experience. And I'm going to start with that. So some people have asked me questions about this novel as I was reading it. And now that I have finally read the whole thing, I can answer those questions and also others that I asked myself before I started this reading project. Because yes, reading Proust was a reading project for me. I decided to read 1 volume a month, no matter what. I began in January this year and it took me 7 months to complete. Each volume was always the last book I started every month, once I had finished all the other books that I wanted to read in that month. But it was not necessarily always the last book I read, because sometimes I had time to squeeze 1 or 2 other books when I was done with the volume I was reading that month. Now, I am not suggesting you take this exact approach. What I am saying is that I think you need a reading plan, something that will work for you and keep you motivated if you want to tackle this. For me, what worked was thinking about it as 7 different novels that I combined with other books. Also, coming back to them regularly ensured that the novel always stayed fresh in my mind, and it was always something that I look forward to. Now, is In Search of Lost Time a difficult novel? That depends on the kind of reader you are. But there are 2 main difficulties. One that is linguistic, and the other one has to do with content. Here's how you can deal with those difficulties. So In Search of Lost Time is a huge novel. It has extensive paragraphs with extremely long sentences. If you're reading it in translation, find a translation that works for you. I cannot recommend you one, but what I can do is suggest that you get free samples from different translations online or grab different translations from different editions in a physical bookstore. Pick a random passage and read different translations of it, and then just get the version that you find easier to follow. Even then, a lot of people don't read beyond the first volume, and that was my case for years. I would read volume 1, take a break, and then the break would become long. So long, in fact, that I would forget what I read, and I had to go back to the beginning every time. Now, the way to avoid that is to come up with a plan and stick to it. I promise you that the novel will get easier the more you read, because you will get used to the long sentences and the novel's rhythm. One thing I did was to read whole chunks of it out loud. I think that helps tremendously. It will slow you down, but you see, I think you need to read this novel slowly. If you try to rush through it, you will only become frustrated. Begin by reading it out loud, which makes it a lot easier to understand, trust me. And once you become familiar with it and invested in the characters, you will not want to stop reading it. Now, about content. Some people might find In Search of Lost Time difficult to read because of its frank and open discussions on sexuality, particularly male and female homosexuality. If you're an adult and that kind of thing bothers you, you're not worthy of reading Proust. That's all I have to say about that. But the novel might also be hard to read for some people because it has very little plot. It does have a plot and it will come together beautifully at the end, but Proust can stay on pages and pages describing a party, for example. There is a lot of description and not a lot of action. And there are long conversations that can last for pages. But something I loved about this novel is that I think it takes place during a fascinating time in European and world history. And talking about that, you will need a bit of knowledge about the history of that period. Not much though, but I would suggest that you at least Google the Dreyfus Affair if you have never heard of it, because you will need at least a running knowledge of what that is and the impact it had in France. Also, knowing a bit about Franco-Prussian relations might help. So that's a relationship between France and Prussia, not Russia. Prussia. I hope I'm not making In Search of Lost Time sound like a slog. This novel can be and should be also hugely enjoyable, so let's talk about that. So In Search of Lost Time has an unnamed narrator. His name might or might not be Marcel, and in this novel he shares many of his experiences with us, the readers. The narrator's milieu is the Parisian upper class during fin du siècle and early 20th century France, up until and including the beginning of World War I. It is unclear how old the narrator is, but he begins the novel by remembering his childhood. At that time, he lives vicariously through his neighbor and friend of the family, Monsieur Swann, and Swann's romance with a courtesan named Odette. In later volumes, the narrator is older. He tells us about his love for Gilberte and Albertine. We'll learn more about other characters from his social class, like Monsieur Norpois, Madame de Villeparisis, and her nephew, Monsieur Charlus, a really fascinating character, Robert de Saint-Loup, etc., but also the narrator's faithful maid and often a source of comic relief, Françoise. In some volumes, these characters make small appearances, while in others they become major characters, and you will get familiar with them as you read on. It is fascinating to me that Marcel Proust, who was gay and his mother was Jewish, although he was raised Catholic, decided to make his narrator neither of those things. Instead, he created other prominent characters in the novel who were homosexual, like Monsieur Charlus, and Jewish, like Monsieur Swann. But except for those two characteristics, Jewishness and homosexuality, it is easy to identify the narrator with Proust because he uses details from his own life in the novel. Okay, I will not lie to you. I found parts of the first 3 volumes a bit of a slog. I love the language, but couldn't get invested in the lives of these French posh people so readily. But then I read volume 4, Sodom and Gomorrah, and I was fascinated by the portrayal of homosexuality in the upper classes at the beginning of the 20th century. I lapped it up, and the final 3 volumes too. But why don't we talk about the 7 volumes one by one, without major spoilers. So, after being rejected by different publishers, the first volume came out in 1919. Its title is Swann's Way, or in French, Du côté de chez Swann, and it begins with the narrator remembering his childhood, as I said, and the time he spent in his family's country house in Cambrai. The narrator, like Proust, was a sickly child who grew up in an extremely sheltered environment. Those first few pages and the rest of the volume 1 are among the most beautiful pages I have ever read in a book. The most prominent character in Swann's Way is, of course, Charles Swann, who is a high society Jewish man, friend to the narrator's parents. But many characters that will become more prominent in later volumes are already present from the start. Monsieur Charlus, Bergotte, Bloch, Gilberte, Françoise. The main storyline is the romance between Swann and the beautiful but vulgar Odette, a courtesan of limited intelligence and unlimited vanity. The second volume is In the Shadow of Young Girls in Flower, or in French, À l'ombre de jeunes filles en fleurs. The second volume came out in 1919, and it won the Prix Goncourt that year. In this second volume, the narrator tells us about his adolescence, his first failed attempts at writing, and his first romantic and erotic attractions, and particularly his friendship with Gilberte, the daughter of Monsieur Swann, and Odette, who has since then, since volume 1, become Madame Swann. The friendship between Gilberte and the narrator is fraught, her parents disapprove, and eventually the narrator loses interest in her. Later, another girl comes into his life, Albertine. The third volume is The Guermantes Way, or in French, Le Côté de Guermantes. Originally, it came out as 2 volumes, one in 1920 and the other one in 1921. In this third volume, the narrator tells about his family's relationship with their neighbors, the Guermantes, who are an aristocratic family. Many conversations in this volume revolved around the famous Dreyfus affair that shook fin de siècle French society. Like French society during the Third Republic, the characters of the novel are divided into pro-Dreyfus and anti-Dreyfus camps, or as they were known at the time, the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. The fourth volume is Sodom and Gomorrah, or Sodome et Gomorrhe in French. The title is, of course, taken from the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible. If you want to learn more about the biblical story that inspired Proust, you can check out my video on Genesis. You will find a link to that video in the show notes. So originally, Sodom and Gomorrah came out also as 2 volumes. The first volume was published in 21 and the second one in 22, so 100 years ago. This fourth volume begins with a narrator describing a sexual encounter between 2 men, Monsieur Charlus and Jupien. As readers, we get to peek into the fascinating secret society of homosexual men in France at the time. This volume is mostly about that, in fact, and also about the complicated relationship between the narrator and Albertine. Fifth volume, The Prisoner, sometimes also translated as The Captive, which in French is La Prisonnière, was published in 1923. And in this volume, the narrator describes the time in which Albertine lived with the narrator in his family's apartment in Paris. And as the title suggests, Albertine practically becomes a prisoner of the jealous narrator. Now, problematic as this may sound to us, this is one of the most beautiful parts of the novel. The sixth volume is The Fugitive, Albertine Gone, or in French, Albertine Disparue, which kind of gives away what it is about. This is also the shorter volume in the collection, and it first came out in 25. You can probably guess from the title that in this volume, Albertine has left the narrator. Interestingly, things almost go full circle when he meets Gilberte again. And I say almost because well, you need to read the book to find out. The seventh and final volume is entitled Finding Time Again, Time Regained, or The Past Recaptured, depending on your translation. The original French title is Le Temps Retrouvé, and it came out in 1927. I could say that this final volume is different from all the others, but actually, each of the volumes is different. In this final book, however, things seem familiar enough at first, but then there is a shift and a leap forward in time, and the narrator describes life in Paris during World War I. This final volume is fascinating because we get to read about the impact of the war on the narrator's milieu. After the war, the narrator, who knows he's dying, tries to write about his world and reflects on the effect life and the passing of time had on all the people he knows and on himself. In Search of Lost Time is one of the most complex novels I have read. It must have been revolutionary when it first came out because of how it explores memory, how it deals with that. And I think the word Proustian now refers to moments when a character tries to arouse an unconscious memory in fiction, something that characters or narrators never did in novels before Proust did it. So In Search of Lost Time is a philosophical and psychological novel that you could spend a long time trying to unravel. So a lot of people say that it is a novel about memory. Proust created a kind of novel that if you read high-end contemporary literary fiction, you kind of might be used to by now, but if you read 19th century plot-driven novels, which is what most people at that time read, you will find this novel revolutionary. I particularly enjoy how Proust deals with memory, but my favorite thing about this novel is its treatment of homosexuality. For example, the narrator, who is heterosexual, usually suspects his lovers of having affairs with other women. And it is never too clear if they do or not, but he is obsessed with that. Also, one of his friends, Monsieur Charlus, whom I mentioned earlier, is a prominent homosexual character in the novel. But there are other homosexual characters as well in this novel. And although the narrator is ostensibly straight, he just seems to know a little bit too much about homosexuality, male homosexuality, so I am tempted to read him as a closeted homosexual, much like Proust himself was. I read somewhere that some critics believe that the narrator's 2 lovers, Gilberte and Albertine, are based on men, and that Proust just feminized the names Gilbert and Albert to create these 2 characters. And I guess that's possible. Well, what more can I say? This is an amazing book. Let me know your thoughts. Bye.